piston is one of those engine parts that you'll probably never see in your life, unless you're doing some major engine repair. It's actually located inside of a cylinder inside the engine block, which is the main component of your whole engine. Everything else in the engine is piled pretty much on top of the engine block, so you pretty much have to remove everything in order to even get to your piston. So the piston, what most people think of a piston, is probably this. And actually, it's just the top part of that. Just the top cylindrical part is actually the piston. That bottom part there is actually just called a connector rod, which connects the piston to the crankshaft down below. So now if we take a closer look at the piston here, that top part of the piston is actually called the crown or the head. So now moving on down the piston, you're actually going to see like probably 3 grooves that are kind of engraved into the piston. Those are for piston rings. Now in between each groove there's going to be kind of little strips that are left behind. Those are called lands. And pretty much anything down below the piston rings is called the skirt. So now, as I said before, that bottom part there is actually called the connector rod. It's connected to the piston by something called a gudeon pin. The gudeon pretty much just means a pivot. So if you look at this piston here, this is the underneath of it, you can see 2 holes on each side. There's going to be a pin that pretty much slides in there and it goes through the piston connecting rod. The small end of the connecting rod is going to be the top, and the big end is going to be connected to the crankshaft on the bottom. So there are 2 different ways that you can connect the connecting rod to the piston, and the first one is just called a semi-floating, which pretty much looks like this, and it's going to have a pin that goes through, but it's going to have a bolt that kind of goes up and tightens it to that. So the second way, which is the most popular one, is actually called a fully floating one, and it looks like this, and it's pretty much going to have a rod that goes straight through the top of the connecting rod, and there's going to be things called circlips on each end that pretty much hold that in place so it doesn't like swivels from side to side and cut into the cylinder walls. So now the other end of the connecting arm is connected to the crankshaft down below. The way it is connected to the crankshaft is it's actually in 2 parts here. So one part is the bottom part's actually going to come off. It'll sit on the crankshaft, and then you'll put the other part back on top. And then there'll be 2 bolts and 2 nuts that will attach it to the crankshaft. So now that you know what a piston is, what does it do? So the point of a piston is to turn heat energy into mechanical work. So the way it works is you're going to have air coming in, you're going to have fuel coming in from the injectors, and you're going to have a spark plug on the top that's going to ignite that combination. When that ignites, it's pretty much going to expand, and as that gas expands, it pushes the piston down, which turns the crankshaft, and then it goes back up and it pushes the exhaust out of into the exhaust manifold. But it keeps going up and down, so it's a 4 stroke, so it goes up, down, and that's pretty much 1 stroke there. So when it hits the top, that's actually what they call top dead center, and when it's completely at the bottom of its rotation, it's going to be bottom dead center. And pretty much once that's all complete, it goes down to the crankshaft, which turns the crankshaft, which there turns that heat energy of the combustion up above into mechanical work down below, because the turning of the crankshaft is going to turn the transmission, which in fact turns the wheels. As I said earlier, there's also going to be piston rings involved in the piston. There's usually going to be about 3, but there could be up to about 5 on a piston. So the point of the piston ring is to keep the gases in the combustion chamber up above and the oil down below. So they're not technically actually rings. They're actually going to have a split in one spot so they can kind of expand and contrast when the engine heats up. So when they're installed, there's probably going to be about a 0.3 to 0.35 millimeter gap between both sides of the ring. So now the top ring is usually called a compression ring because it's going to be up above and it's going to be pretty much trying to keep that gas up above into the combustion chamber so it doesn't leak down into the oil. If it does leak down, that's what they call blow-by. Sometimes when it goes up and down, it can kind of seep in between the rings and get into the oil, which is not a good thing. And then on the other end, the other 2 rings pretty much on the bottom are going to be oil scraper rings or oil control rings. So the bottom one is pretty much, they're usually kind of curved a little bit. So that when the piston goes up, it's going to let the oil go up. And when it goes back down, it's kind of going to scrape that oil back down into the oil sump, which is also just the oil pan. And also there's going to be holes, as you see on this piston here, just below that last ring. And the point of those is actually so when it's going back down, it's easier for the oil to kind of get compressed, so it kind of flows through those holes back down through the piston. So because the piston rings have to deal with such crazy pressure and temperature, they're usually made out of cast iron, or nowadays they're more made out of aluminum alloy, and they're usually actually covered with a wear-resistant material such as chromium or nitride. And lastly, usually the piston is actually just a little bit smaller than the cylinder, just so there's going to be kind of space on each side for lubricant to get in to make sure that there's not going to be friction or anything. That little gap there is what they call piston clearance. And it's usually probably between 0.025 and 0.1 millimeters wide. So you can actually have a lot of issues with pistons if you have that gap at the wrong size. If you have too small of a size, it's actually going to be losing power because of the friction. And if you have too much clearance, you're going to have a thing called piston slap, which pretty much means the piston is moving inside of the cylinder. There you have it, guys, everything you want to know about pistons and how it works. Make sure to subscribe. Next week we'll be digging deeper into the engine bay, so we'll see you guys next week. Bye.